And she's not in, oh, this is hot. She's not in the Zoom yet. And we can't get started just yet. No. I have to unmute.
Chairing Rick? Nope, I'm just the designated alternate for whoever.
We're good to go? All right, welcome one and all to this wonderful Sunday, summer, feels like Sunday already. UPC meeting, should be having it outside on these classic days today. So I call this meeting to order. You see here, is there anyone who is not present besides Libby? Looks like we're all here, right? What's that?
I think we're good.
All right, good. All right, any changes to the agenda?
I'd like to add under new business P, rate consultant, how shall we say, get a rate consultant on the approved vendors list for the city for second opinions, if in the case it needs to be.
So,
However you want to say that.
okay,
Under new business B.
got it. Okay, any other changes? All right, so we got the agenda set. Hello, guests, standard folks, nice to see anybody. Does anyone make a motion to accept the July 14th minutes?
I'll move.
Motion made by Jeff Chamberlain,
Support.
supported by Tom Wheat. Any discussion? All right. All right, then all in favor of accepting the July 14th minutes, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Thank you. Now is the opportunity for public comment. We'll start with anyone who's in the chambers here who'd like to make a public comment. Is there anybody online who wants to make a public comment? All right. Unfinished business. Stan Tech updates. Mr. Baker, is that you?
Yes, I can provide an update on that. So, this general housekeeping item, we know there's 1 month usually between meetings. There is, we'll call that 4 weeks. And then there's this unique 3 weeks between meeting end and minutes distribution, or excuse me, agenda distribution. So there's a week that happens that we kind of leave off to where there's been a lot of updates in the last week, and we did not include that in the agenda. So to give you some updates on that, we have pre-qualified Stantec, so that they are now a pre-qualified firm to work with the city that actually. We've also requested a proposal from Stantec for a number of services to include the rate study as formally included in the agreement. We've also asked for some more detailed cost of service analysis and further dives into those various rate categories support with an ongoing work project that UPC is taken up, which is the front foot fees and some of those other cost distributions within different townships, and kind of get to this equal rate concept. Although we don't have that for new service connections, that could range from pretty high to just the construction cost. So putting all that together, we have prepared a proposal and recommendation for contract to go to the city commission on September 6th. It was for $149,575. And again, there's a number, almost like a cafeteria cart item of things that we're looking to do, including the formal rate recommendations in accordance with the contract. So just the way the meetings are timed, it's going to go to city commission before formally comes to UPC. Had I had it 6 days prior, it would come to UPC first. I think it's important that we continue on that trajectory. Otherwise, it won't go to city commission until October. We have Stantec on the call here today. Stantec has been working with us, with Peter Hafner, Mr. Hafner, as well as city staff, and with our existing consultant, Mark Foster. So work is happening, and work is going to continue to happen. And so we'd like to bring that contract to city commission without delay.
Thank you, Director Baker. Questions for Director Baker?
No.
Concerns? Okay. All right. Appreciate that update. Water rates discussion. Do you want to kick that off, Director Baker?
Yeah, go ahead and introduce, we've got Mr. Foster, we've got Stantec on the line here, so we'll turn it over to them. They'll be going over a document that we went over with Mr. Hafner. It's really a forecast document, and it shows kind of, where we're at now and where we're headed. And, we talked last meeting about all these things that we're kind of seeing, changes, and what is going to occur in the future. So this stuff is complicated. It's hard to make sense of it all sometimes. And so we'll encourage UPC members to ask questions. And if something's not intuitive, let's talk about it. I'm going to use an analogy related to aviation. Imagine if we were kind of all in the airplane on our flight, we're at 30,000 feet, and all of a sudden we start dropping altitude. Say we're at 27,000 feet, but we're nose down and we're diving. So somebody may ask, well, what's the problem? We're all in the air still, right? Why do anything? And so I'm going to, through the help of Mr. Foster and Stantec, we're going to walk through that discussion today. And so the goal is to have the UPC walk away with an understanding of why we need to do something, why we need to grab the handles of this airplane and start pulling up. And then two, I think something that we're going to have to talk about, we're going to have to get some direction and understanding of where the UPC sits on it, in terms of when do we make those control adjustments? Do we do it now and in January? Do we wait and do it all in January? And just kind of what is the impact on that? What does the UPC feel about that? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Foster first, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, James. Would it be okay if I shared my screen to kind of walk some folks through some exhibits? Great. The host is going to have to allow me.
Okay, now what you do with your.
All right, be able to do that.
Thank you. Excuse me. And James, did you want me to kind of set the table on both the utilities, water and wastewater, or do you want me to just stick to the water analysis?
Well, I think it's helpful to introduce that. The events in wastewater really kind of set the table for us to talk about this in water. And if the UPC remembers, we talked about some big things that happened in wastewater that got us to the point where we were requesting some analysis to be done. So I think that is helpful for the members, understanding that the UPC really just has focus on water.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So back in June, I think, maybe late May, I was contacted by James, and we had a conversation with a lot of the city team about the apparent, well, not the apparent, the impacts that inflation was having on the operations of both the water and wastewater utilities. And the real critical item was, and James will provide the specifics, but increase in wastewater treatment contracts, operating expenses, and chemicals to the tune of over $4 million. That was real impacts on 2022 operating expenses, well over budget, and was going to do some, all else being equal, was going to do some really nasty things to the revenue profile of the wastewater system and the ability to maintain acceptable financial metrics when things are reported out. The notion of, hey, I love James's analogy. We're diving here. What's the most appropriate course of correction? And this concept of making a rate adjustment during the current year to try to smooth that descent was what was put in front of us. As we were talking about it, the realities of the inflationary arc were noted to hit water as well. Not as dramatic. The descent was not as steep, but as long as the city is considering corrective actions, it is prudent to look at both sides of the house. So I crafted a memorandum with some recommendations for consideration back in July. Subsequently had some review conversations with the city and then with Andy from Stantec. And then was it last week? Last week, James and I and Andrew and Peter got on the phone. And what you have in front of you on the screen is kind of the working version of a forecast update model for the water system that I've prepared, have incorporated some of Stantec's comments and incorporated some of Peter's comments to get to where we are today. So I'm going to cut to the quick and then kind of walk you through some of the specifics. The corrective plan that James is mentioning needs an influx of additional revenue compared to what the existing rates are provided and compared to what the rate arc was projected to be when I did the rate study back in November with the then 5-year forecast. Absent that, the financial metrics for the water system are going to be awful and lead to potentially some events that the water utility should try to avoid. Downgrades in credit ratings, needs to file deficit reduction plans, things along those lines. So that kind of sets the table for what I want to really present in the metrics and whatnot. And I'm going to just attempt, and please stop me if you need more detail as I go through, rather than keep any questions to the end. Pardon me, it's early here. The notion of this is that there are 3 key financial metrics that I'm focusing on in terms of the health of the financial picture of the water system. And each of these is laid out in some degree of detail in the utility financial policy that the commission adopted back in the mid-90s that has really stayed in place through today. And as I understand the UPC's charter, these policies are the types of things that are within your realm. So as we go through these and I introduce to you what those policies are, other than just the numbers and what the forecast looks like, it would be important for you to consider whether those policies are things that the UPC wants to endorse, suggest modifications, or something along those lines. This first metric is what is known as debt service coverage. In simple terms, the city, through its bond ordinances, when it issues revenue bonds, has covenanted that it will set rates that are designed to generate a debt service coverage ratio, more in a moment, of not less than 1.2, which is what you're seeing on the top line right here. Now, that debt service coverage ratio is defined as money in the door minus what you got to pay for normal operating expenses divided by the debt service on the bonds that are out there. Put another way, if you owe your bondholders $1 million next year, you are required by covenant to set rates in order to have, after you've paid for your operating expenses, $1.2 million. That's the coverage ratio, 1.2 divided by 1. The utility financial policy back in the mid-90s deemed that that wasn't good enough for maintaining the value of the systems and all the other objectives, and set a policy minimum of 1.4 times. I will tell you, in my experience, that was sufficient, but very low back in the mid-90s. The rating agencies and other investment community and analysts, 1.4 is no good. They want to see a much higher coverage ratio. What we've been working towards in recent financial plans is trying to get that up to 1.75. That's what I've defined as the sustainability target. I'm going to skip the forecast for a moment and introduce the other two metrics before I go into the forecast specifics. The second forecast metric is this days cash ratio. The way that it's calculated is really how much cash do you have at any point in time compared to your annual cost of operating the system. And when I say operating the system, I'm just talking about James's operating budget. I'm not talking about any capital financing, any debt service, any capital spend. What is the O&M budget and how much cash do you have? And just do the math. So there are various building blocks to this in the policy, in the utility financial policy. What it results in is a minimum target days cash ratio of 180 days is what you're seeing right here. And obviously, if the budget goes up, then that cash ratio would go up as well. The final metric that we're evaluating here, and if I showed you the wastewater, and if James wants me to, I will, is really just what we used to refer to as equity. What does your balance sheet look like? Are you in the black or are you in the red? It's the unrestricted net position. On wastewater, these numbers are all in the red. On water, this metric is not a problem. So this is the least concerning of the targets that we're looking at on water right now. You want it healthy, you don't want it in the red. So I'm going to back up now and kind of walk you through the progression of these scenarios that we've laid out here. The first one is the baseline forecast that we did when we computed the 2022 water and wastewater rates. So this was based on Intel, what we knew really probably in October of 2021. It was the capital program that was on paper then. It was the budget that was on paper then. It was the assumptions regarding how much sales were going to be there in terms of revenue. And then it had the rate arc that we had proposed at the time, which, after the 2022 rates went into place, if you go back and look at that document, our 5-year forecast assumed 15% in 2023, 7.5% in 24, 5, and 6. Those were designed to fund a very aggressive capital program and still have acceptable metrics, principally on the debt service coverage for water, and then also on the days cash. We actually managed the days cash in our financing plan to approximate the minimum amount required by the utility financial policy. We allowed the coverage to dip a little below the 1.4 in the out years, knowing that the capital program would continue to morph and that those 7.5% increases in the out years would likely have to be revisited if there were, if the capital pressures that were assumed at the time stayed in the system. We also were recognizing that, hey, we can't forecast the future as it relates to financing vehicles available to the water utility. I know the city's been very active in state revolving fund efforts and principal forgiveness opportunities there. We didn't forecast any of those. We only forecast what we knew at the time was secured. So we weren't uncomfortable forecasting going below 1.4 in the out years. As we sit here today with the current estimate, the water OpEx, the water operating expenses is about $1 million over what we anticipated annually back in 2022. I don't see any end in sight. Even if things return to, I don't even know what normal is anymore, but if this particular cycle of inflation smooths out by the time we get to next year, which I don't think many economists really think are going to happen, but even if it did, that $1 million is there. In my experience, there's no deflation that occurs on some of these unit prices for commodities and whatnot. So we've assumed that $1 million increase is the new normal in operating expenses, and that it runs through the forecast period and then gets inflated. The quick message here is, if that's the case, and there is no change in plans in terms of overall rate increases going forward, we're going to run into some very problematic numbers on the rate covenant. The debt service coverage would go below 1.2, perhaps as soon as next year, definitely towards the end of the forecast period. What does that mean? It depends on what bond counsel and what bond holders interpret. In my experience, simply because you report a rate, a debt service coverage lower than your rate covenant doesn't create a violation. I mean, you planned to get there, something happened and you didn't get there. Now, having said that, if the people that are setting the rates are looking at a forecast that shows them they're not going to get there, they have, by covenant with the bondholders, said they won't approve those rates. They'll have to jack them up in order to create acceptable ratios. What we put on the table for consideration was, okay, let's take immediate action in 2022, try to get it done in time to create some impact on the 2022 results, and then looking longer term, modify the ARC in 24, 25, and 26. That was this proposed forecast for consideration. And really what you can see was it's 10% in 2022. And if you could get 3 months of that 10% increase in the door, or at least counted for revenue during 2022, you got about a 10-point impact on the coverage ratio in the current year. But that 10% stays with you throughout the forecast period. So if you maintain the 15% in 2023, and then have the 10% going across the rest of the way, that's kind of, with all the current assumptions, that's the minimum base case proposal that I would be comfortable putting into a forecast, because it's really keeping you above the 1.4 debt service coverage ratio that is the utility policy minimum. Alternatively, and this was something that both Andrew and Peter suggested we put on the table for consideration, is, well, what happens if you don't do the 10% right now? And the most immediate answer is, well, you're not going to affect 2022, obviously. And so for simplicity, just to illustrate the alternative, what we've assumed is, instead of 10% now and 15%, which based on past practice, we've assumed wouldn't really take place until March 1st. The cadence lately has been following the budget and the approval cycle season. And by the time the rates go through the readings in early January and get put into place, it's usually been March 1st in the last couple of years. So that's the assumptions on this proposed forecast. The alternative we looked at is, well, maybe we don't need 10% today, but we're going to need that 10% plus the 15% to fix 2023 going on. So the alternative forecast assumes 25% effective on January 1, not on March 1. That's as far as we went with alternatives. We all, James, Peter, Andrew, and I, we all recognize that there are all kinds of different ways you could juggle the 5-year numbers. Quite frankly, this is based on some stale data on the capital program that I know James and team are hard at work on updating those figures. To the extent that the capital program is modified one way or the other. I know the inflationary pressures are huge on the capital side of the house as well, and may create opportunities to revisit exactly which and when projects to do, right? But on the other hand, if there's essential projects that are in the hopper, they're not getting cheaper. My suspicion is that you're experiencing what most of my clients are, and bids coming in, 2.5 times the engineer's estimate. So that's a challenge that I know James is hard at work on, trying to fully vet and understand what the capital needs are before we finalize the 2023 budget plan for both water and wastewater. So those are the scenarios that we've kind of batted around. When we talked last time, Peter suggested and I think it's a good suggestion, it would be helpful for stakeholders, including you guys, to understand, well, what does that mean in terms of annual revenue? And what does that mean in terms of impact on a monthly residential bill? And actually, I made an error here. This is the quarterly bill. And if I could put my glasses on, I could type. So just to cut to the quick, 3 months of revenue at a 10% increase provides $650,000 for the current year, but annually it's 4 times that. So the arc of going forward, these 10%, I wanted to show you how much revenue we're talking about for each one of these adjustments, right? And they compound. So a 10% when you get out to 2025 already has these other increases in it, so it provides more revenue. And then also, what does that mean on a typical quarterly residential bill? One way or another, if we need to get to the 25% for 2023, whether that's 10 now and 15 later, or 25 later, we're talking about $20 a quarter on an $82, what is currently an $82 per bill quarter for both city customers and township customers, because we have fully got into rate equalization now on the water system. So I'll stop there, James. I think I've hopefully done an executive summary overview of how we got to where we are. And I'm here to answer any questions or go into more detail.
Thank you, Bart. Questions for James or Bart at this time?
I would just point out, Hefner, that unrestricted net position at the bottom is a calculation that is coming through finance, through treasury, and you wouldn't see that on the financial statements if you were to look, and that terminology is used on financial statements, and I walked through that with Andrew and Bart, the calculation process, just to make you aware of that. So should you look at the statements, you're not going to see those numbers at the bottom. And I did get together with Bart and Andrew, and we walked through the scenarios and looked at the model before I met with them, and we did a Zoom. Bart walked us through this process, and Andrew noted that he made some suggestions to the model, which were modified. And
that, you know, the conclusion is that based on these assumptions, and realize this is 100% assumptions, you know, what's going to happen in the next 6 months or the next year or whatever, you know, this is the picture we're looking at. And we will get to a point where we'll discuss what action we may or may not take. I suspect, and I'd like to participate in that as well. Commenting wise.
Let's have a few questions. I guess no one else says right now. Just to help me clarify it. So for example, our in-house labor costs, reasonably predictable, right? I mean, they're negotiated, you know, by contract, that sort of thing. So I know for that piece of our work, I mean, we're not experiencing some, you know, 10% increase necessarily in in-house labor costs. So just for the picture of it, you know, is the big driver of cost contract, and is it materials? And are we really seeing a huge increase in materials costs? And these are a lot of questions stacked up. Are engineers' projections going to soon catch up, you know, with what the real world numbers are looking like? I know this is, like you said, this is like a lot of kind of crystal ball work. And I don't know what all that means, kind of just on that whole expense side. Is this just like the new normal? You know, gas prices have dropped, you know, what's?
Some of it is, on my way in, they were talking about the inflationary factors on the radio. Electricity, 15% increase. So that's not something that was factored into the original model. And then I believe there's chemicals, and I'm sure you can go on from that point in time, and the additional staff to meet requirements. So those are a couple of things that I'm aware of.
So, Your Honor, just to kind of attempt to start to answer some of those questions, and there's a lot of questions there, but
Yeah.
I think just to kind of come back to some of the fundamentals behind rate making is that, you know, we projected the rates that we're in right now. So the 2022 rates, you know, were calculated during a period that ended in November of 2020. So we really have to, today is really what we knew back in November of 2020. And so, you know, what was fuel prices at, you know, what was fuel doing back in November of 2021? What were our chemicals doing back in November of 2021? You know, all these other things, contracts and construction, all that kind of stuff. So that's what based our rate projections where we're at today. And so this conversation is really, in as much as it is all the details and everything, it's really, what did we know we didn't know back in 21, November 21? And what did we think we didn't know, but now we know we didn't know? So just a compounding of all these things. Another thing that always happens rate year to rate year to rate year is, you know, did I end the budget where I thought I was going to end the budget? Did I make the revenue that I thought I was going to make? Because we're making revenue projections on this as well. But that's another thing. As commercial industries, as our you know, citizens and, you know, mom and pops come out of COVID, are they coming out of COVID at the rate trajectory that we projected them to come out of COVID, or are we getting that somewhere? And so when you go out like we are today, and we have, you know, kind of these three main things, if you will, like arcs or lines that we're trying to hold and get it right, is the budget that we're in. We talked about things that can make that change, the revenue that we projected, and then all these new inflationary increases, electricity, chemicals. We're also transitioning in a number of ways some level service requirements within drinking water. So in drinking water, we are moving to liquid blended phosphate. That's something that's been in our budgets. That's something that we've been projecting to do. But as we step into that, now we're also facing major escalations in pricing. So So we knew there was gonna be some cost increase to that. We attempted to put some, projections to that, but we're realizing now that we're getting that. There are cost increases with staff over the next 2 to 3 years as we purposely plan to increase staff to address a number of level service issues in the lead program and a number of other programs. That's not what this conversation is about. We're not saying that we need 25% rate increase because we need to hire a couple people over the next couple of years. So I don't want to, I want to be completely honest and say there are more people projected in the future, but I also want to be honest and say that those people are not representative of 25% rate increase. Talking about capital, there's a little bit of a separate conversation, but I'm going to attempt to kind of talk through that. So the first thing that we need to recognize is that from a rate standpoint, we take the entire capital program, we apply a capital variance to it, usually about 8%, and then we take that value and we look to fund it through a pay-go component, usually 10 to 12%, and then a bond component of it. And then we usually try to project it over an 18-month period. So you may take, $20 million of capital, and then we look to finance about, actually we look to build about $18 million of that capital. We then take and we look to bond finance somewhere in the neighborhood of $16 million of that capital, 16 to 17 million. So the rate revenue requirements are going to be based on the debt service to pay for that project. So it's not a one-for-one. And once we get kind of into the actual rate year, to say that, in for example, if there was a project that completely stalled and went away, or a project that completely went over budget, kind of the two extremes, that's no real immediate rate impact. Because when we issue the bond proceeds, when we issue the bonds, we take those proceeds. And so we're, in the example I used of $18 million, we've got $18 million now sitting here on the table, and we're going to go do the work. And so if we say, well, let's not do the work, we still have $18 million sitting on the table. We still have to make debt and interest payments on $18 million. And so the work is kind of independent of that. Now, somewhat complex as we talk through that, but there is, broadly speaking, we're seeing on every contract that we award somewhere between 20 and 30% cost increase from what we originally anticipated. So that is affecting us. And over time, that capital program does, the capital program does directly impact rates. There's no doubt about it. And the rate arc that we're on today, the 15% that we talked about, that was already planning for, we left in November, we said, hey, 15% next year. That's based on our very robust and continuous capital improvement program. So there's this very real connection between capital and rates. There certainly is. But when we're in the current year, there's not a lot of things that are going to change in the capital program that's going to currently affect it. So if that makes sense.
So for instance, I think we saw there was a $1 million grant for lead service line replacement with our board packet. I think there was a memo. Trying to put that into terms with James talking about, the capital component is not always an immediate implications. Well, that $1 million grant theoretically would allow you to reduce your borrowing by $1 million, so you won't realize that $1 million theoretically until that debt service would have come due over a 20-year period. Right. So you're really only saving maybe $50,000 a year on their projection. Yeah. And it depends how you play the game of how much you're going to borrow versus how much you're going to cash finance. But I wanted to throw that out there because seeing that $1 million, it's like, well, isn't that just our savior this time? And it's really that long-term look that it would reduce the debt service that's projected into the future. Yeah. And looking out into years 24, 25, 26, I think we will always be looking out into the next year, understanding there's implications of all this capital. But we're not, I don't think it's our place to today say, yeah, we're going 10 in 24 and 10 in 25. That's kind of where it looks like it needs to go. But between now and 24, we have an opportunity to look at capital and what are these costs and what is the priority, and we have some input into that. Now I realize that there's no, as far as I know, and Bart can chime in, as far as I know, there's no outside city capital that isn't lead service line, you know, expansion type of information included in any of those forecasts either. Which would even make that number even higher, I would suspect. And I think that's coming down the pipe in the future when the townships provide their, what do you call it, their capital plan or what have you.
Yeah, I will say there is significant work going on in the township right now.
Right, but not necessarily expansion.
Well, I mean, it's work that supports expansion. It's not new development housing expansion. A lot of that is done by the developers themselves. I'm very aware of that, but be advised that the UBC did just approve a upsizing agreement for new expansion in Pavilion Township. There's also the $6 million 33rd Street loop that's happening right now.
Sure.
That's more system improvements, and it's going to help the reliability and resiliency of the system, but it's all part of the big system in the house. I just want to make sure that the UBC is aware that there's a significant amount of capital happening in the townships. Lake Street is another example of that.
I guess I would just communicate that capital plans for the townships have not been provided to look into 5 or 10 or whatever years out.
Yeah, well, I think so. That's going to be an annual ask to get the capital improvements from the township. So there's significant. If you look on the UBC website, there's a 20-year schedule that's out there right now, and that's a lot of our information based on that broad look. And there's specific line items for township main replacement, township main expansion, township facility. So I really want to be very clear with UBC that there's a lot of work going on in the townships. This is not just city spending for that capital program.
What's our policy about when we expense and when we capitalize in terms of the investment side of things? So then, and how does that work in the grand scheme of things for a rate between we got interest expense, but we got depreciation? Is that correct? Do we have depreciation expense that comes into play? And how does that play back into this?
My understanding of this rate for the contract is basically there are reserves that are proposed for emergencies and debt service and capital outlay, and those really drive everything. Depreciation really doesn't drive anything. It's a non-cash transaction.
Right.
So it's really, rates are very impacted by how much you bond. So if you have a fixed amount of capital, $20 million, and you bond 16 million, you got to come up with that floor in rates, that differential. And you factor out all these non-cash things, such as depreciation. And then there's these reserves. So just basically, how much cash do you need to operate and to do capital projects that isn't bonded, and then to fund these reserves? So dollars go into a capital reserve, and then they get expended for that $4 million differential, but you got to rebuild that reserve. That reserve is some calculation. I don't think depreciation, I mean, it's in the numbers, but that's a non-cash item. It's really how much cash are you going to fund for all of your operations and capital, and then you have these reserves. And so if you set the reserves high, you got to have a higher rate.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Peter, I was going to pick up on the notion you were running with, and I'm going to agree with you, but I'm also going to add that, the strategic piece of balancing all this is depreciation does have an impact on that last metric that we were looking at, which is the unrestricted net position and what the balance sheet looks like. And as the city considers plans for wastewater, because that is such a critical metric and is not in good shape right now, you need to take into consideration what the depreciation expense is while you're formulating how much to bond and how much to fund through, pay-go capital, because it does have an impact on what the income statement looks like. And I'll just also pick up on the capital side of things to James's notion. The city bonded in March or April of 2022 for a significant amount of revenue bonds to really get the capital program funded. And on wastewater, it was enough in the funding to probably get us all the way through 2023 without having to go back to the market. In the water forecast right now, there's still a $10 million new bond anticipated for 2023 in this forecast. So where the capital is really going to start impacting this forecast in 2023, 4, 5, and 6 is not what's already out there and is already, has to be paid in debt service, but what developments, if any, are there that will change how much borrowing is in the budget and the forecast for 23, 4, 5, and 6. And to Peter's point, how much of that can be funded from alternative sources, or at least partially, whether that's grants, principal forgiveness on SRF loans, or just lower interest SRF loans. It's difficult. It was hard a year ago to forecast capital financing with all the developments and the loosening up of federal funds and what Eagle is doing with those. That's the biggest moving piece in any of the assumptions on water and wastewater.
So it's been an inordinate amount of time in the weeds. I feel like maybe we've already gotten there, but I guess one last thing, just as a reminder, because we've talked about this, how much of that covering our capital investment costs is the percentage wise in our rate? Is 25% of our rate, to pay for, capital expense, paying back bonds, whatever, 25% operations and pay-go, or however you divide that up? I don't know. What's that?
Do you have an idea, Bart, like $1 million?
I do. I do. Hang on just a second. So in the current estimates, let me get to the current before I do that. Bear with me just a second. So water revenues, including, miscellaneous and investment earnings and things like that, are in the neighborhood of $28 million. Of that $28 million, 18 goes to pay just cost of operations of the system. So 18 divided 28 is roughly 65 cents on the dollar. On top of that, there's $6 million in committed debt service. So stuff that we already have committed to pay to bondholders. So that's 6.8 million is another 37%. So what you're seeing is that, whoops,
I don't think
that's not right. It's not 37. It's 65 cents of every dollar goes to operating. 25 cents of every dollar goes to pay the debt. The other 10 cents on the dollar goes to pay for pilot and whatever we can spend on pay-go capital. Rough figures. It's an interesting question. It's an interesting way to look at it, by the way.
Would it be fair to say about $1 million worth of capital over 20 years will cost you maybe $75,000 a year in rates? Something of that nature. I guess they're 20-year bonds and they would include interest. So something of that nature.
Depending on how you financed it. Yeah, whether it's just all debt or some combination of debt and out of pocket. But yes, we can come up with that metric pretty easily.
I guess just one bigger view question that I get to by setting the table with that is, well, you could say, well, it's not the time to invest in things. We should hold back. that's what's creating all our problems, you know, stop spending so much money on buying new toys, just make this work. And, still, I mean, 65% of our rate is just, operations, and, I mean, I don't know, I'm just thinking of that
Yeah,
as an argument that someone could.
yeah,
propose.
yeah. So with outstanding debt, you're at about 80-some% that you really can't change. You can change maybe 15%. And then I remember when we first got together, you were talking about some of your projects and you were saying, generally, it's not gonna go down in price. It's always going up in price of project. And I don't want to say what I'm saying what you said, but if you agree
Never
with
cheaper
that
to do
concept.
today than it will be, you know, later.
So if they're needed, that's maybe more of the question. They have to be done.
So it really sounds like, you know, the driver of all this stuff here is our immediate costs that are impacted by inflation. I mean, whether it's the chemicals or fuel or electricity, I mean, those are the types of O&M costs that we really don't have any control over because we have to, the system has to do them. I mean, like, as you asked the question, Mayor Anderson, you know, the wages as a line item, they're fairly, I mean, we know that those are pretty well fixed. But it's these other ones that seem to be just, they've gone way beyond what our initial projections were a year ago. And even if we scale back on the capital projects, that's not going to really have much of an immediate impact right now. And that's a longer term discussion as to whether that's the right thing to do at all or not. So, and I know as the system goes, we also don't have the opportunity, we can't buy fewer chemicals because they're what's needed to run the system. We've still got to drive, you know, the system has, you know, the crews have to still drive out to wherever they need to drive out to work on, whether it's, you know, in downtown Kalamazoo or it's out in outlying township somewhere. That's just an expense they have to do.
I think an argument for not putting money for reinvestment into the system is that you're gonna pay for it later on and it's gonna cost you more. Because it was, whatever grade you need today is just going to escalate later on. And either it's gonna be worse than what it is, or the cost is gonna go up too. So I don't think it's smart to stop the investment.
Should we, and if there's more questions, by all means, I would just wonder should we have Bart walk us through the wastewater side and then kind of circle back to say what our thoughts are for the water?
I would like to hear that, because it seems like water and wastewater connected together, right? And so, if they're worse off than water, I'd love to hear it.
And yeah, and then we can circle back, and I don't know that we'll have to have all the, you know, unless there's questions, we could probably just see what we're thinking. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think there's broad benefit for, you know, that understanding and knowledge that helps to put everything in perspective. Just an additional point, we haven't talked about the next thing that I think that UPC needs to also talk about is, you know, kind of the timing and the UPC's appetite to, you know, do one of these rate increases, or UPC's appetite for a very large, what we talked about, 25% rate increase in January. So that discussion to be upcoming, but to keep in mind that the city would likely pursue a mid-year rate increase for wastewater, understanding the magnitude of the challenges that are within that fund. So I just want to kind of make folks aware of that broad intention that does exist. So sure, yeah, Bart, if you have an opportunity, maybe just from a high level, kind of step us through some of the wastewater.
Be happy to. And I think what this is going to point out, in addition to just the immediate challenges and the difference between water and wastewater, is the fundamentals of where we are in the financial picture between water and wastewater. And just as an entree to that, the wastewater utility in recent years has been remarkably debt-free. There's always been debt, but remember we were talking about 65 cents on the water dollar goes to OpEx, and 35 or 25 goes to debt service. If I were to turn back the clock about 3 or 4 years, it was less than a dime or about a dime of the wastewater bill was going to debt service out of every dollar. The capital pressures on wastewater have been traditionally lower than water in recent years. Part of that's because so much of the plant was built with federal dollars years ago and state dollars years and years ago. And the city's been fairly efficient in the replacements to that plant. But compared to water anyway. But the focus on therefore the focus on wastewater in recent years has been primarily to just meet the cash needs. And since there weren't a whole lot of debt service to pay, this is where that depreciation element gets into play. By meeting the cash needs without looking hard enough at the depreciation expense, if I drop down to the bottom line, you're in the red on all these scenarios in the short term. And I'll come back to that as I walk through it. The debt service cut, so this is exact same approach, just using wastewater numbers instead of water numbers. The pressures on wastewater were not necessarily the debt service coverage when we did the forecast last year. That was all in the green, very solid, very high debt service, because again, the capital programs now, if you look at the average annual CapEx spend on wastewater, it's, if memory serves, James, like $11 million in the forecast every year. And in water, you've got numbers that are double that at least. And the revenue profiles are not that much different. So the capital is putting a lot more pressure on water than it is on wastewater. Wastewater's pressures are these other metrics. The cash position, while we were forecasting it as being satisfactory, even under that forecast, we were worried that the deficit, that the equity piece was not really as high as we'd like to see it. We plug in the $4.5 million or $4.3 million additional operating expenses, and it does really bad things to the forecast. It drops the current year rate or debt service coverage below the rate covenant. It drops the cash down to really low reserve balances, and it drops the unrestricted net position to a negative balance. Let me just put a placeholder there, and Peter can address the consequences of this when I'm done in terms of what the state regulators, the state would require in terms of a deficit elimination plan or something. Bottom line is, this is really when we first started talking about these are the alarms that are going off in all of our heads. We've got every metric that if we don't do anything for 2022 is going to look really, really bad for 2022. So the discussion starter was, if we get that 10% in order to improve 2022, to at least avoid, or hopefully try to avoid, a significant consequence on the 2022 metrics, and then revisit how we look going forward. That was the challenge at hand. Unfortunately, even with that 10%, it's only going to provide 3 months of cash at best. So we're probably still going to, again, there's a lot that goes on, as Peter mentioned, and as Mayor Anderson noted, about depreciation and other non-cash things. There are accruals, there are accounting principles, there's how you account for long-term obligations like pension and OPEB that will impact all of this, which is impossible to forecast from my perspective. But my current estimate, if you ask me today, is we're still going to be, even if you take the 10%, a negative net position at the end of 2022. So it's important to take some action, and it's just it's a matter of when and how much now versus when and how much later. But what we put on the table is something for consideration that would return the metrics to in the green and slowly build this is to the extent that there had to be a deficit elimination plan. This is it. It's a series of meaningful rate increases that are more than adequate to meet the other two metrics, but that will pull the net position out of the red. So this is the immediacy of the wastewater piece. And really the options for consideration are not different on water than they are on wastewater.
Is there an unknown that could change this even worse?
Certainly, I mean, certainly, there's always, known unknowns, and we've got some unknown unknowns as well that are always kind of flying in the background, that's really kind of what brought us here. I will say, a few things, and I also want to recognize Andy and Jim from Stantec that are on. But, as we go year over year over year, I'm kind of going back 2 to 3 years with drinking water and our capital, a really robust increase in capital. In fact, one of the slides that we show everybody during our rate presentation, public rate presentation to the City Commission, is this bar chart. And across the bar chart, you've got capital investment represented like a vertical impact on a scale. And you see going back to like 2013, 14, 15, it's really low. The bars are really low. And then as you kind of hit 2017, 18, you really start to increase up. And then 19 and 20, depending on what year we are, just keep getting higher and higher. And as we span through that, we are making a lot of assumptions on project costs, the overall operations and everything else. And then every year we kind of come back to this, and that there is no true open water that just doesn't exist, but there is a real thing that happens during rate revenue requirement setting, is that you look and say, okay, we performed less than we thought we would last year. We were more over budget than we thought we would be, and the projects are costing more. Any one of those things can tip around. And there's a summation effect that happens too. Had we been more aggressive in 21 and 22, and perhaps even in 2020 on rates, had we come after, instead of a 14, 15% that we passed last year, what if we came up after an 18%? That would have been more risky, certainly, but it perhaps would have prevented some of this where we're at today. So there's something that's also very challenging in a water utility today, is that we really are not in the purpose, we don't do it. We don't just go out and get money to sit. If we had done that, if we were able to do that, like, every product you buy in industry, right to the face masks we're all wearing on our face today, they're manufactured by an industry who makes a profit. So it's their sole interest to make as much money as they can to put it in the bank for a rainy day. We don't do that. This is a customer-owned utility. The customers pay the bill on it, and we don't pull any more from the customer than we need to make the thing work into today and tomorrow. So this is really the benefits of a customer-owned utility. And some of those benefits are also, when our costs go up, we're going to ask for some additional support to keep those costs low.
Here's your argument.
And Andy and Jim, I know you folks are on and helped us through a lot of this, certainly with the water discussions. And, feel free to provide any input or narrative into some of the work that we've been doing.
Bart, can you pull up that wastewater again? Your slide? I just want to point out that unrestricted net position. I don't think that the city would be required to prepare a deficit reduction plan like the state. And it's just when we looked at this the other day and how this was being calculated, I think it was pre-state numbered letter 2016-1, which requires that deficit reduction plan be provided in the case that current assets do not exceed current liabilities excluding debt service. And so the big driver here, I'm just looking, and that's my understanding, but the big thing that I'm looking at here is a big component of your current assets are cash. And you can see under the current estimate that cash is much lower than where it was expected to be. But that calculation at the bottom, I'm just not sure that's gonna drive that deficit reduction plan with the state, which basically says in 5 years, how are you gonna correct this situation? So I would say going forward, we should consider that. But I wanna point out that cash is obviously less in the second line of the current estimate versus the baseline. And it would play into it, and I didn't make any attempt to say what, would current assets exceed current liabilities? I think they would, and I think this model at the bottom is, they've had like 3 or 4 situations where accounting standards change, and then the state will change how you calculate if you need this plan. You don't wanna have to go there, I can tell you that, to have a plan. But I think you would probably, in the short term, be okay, briefly, from that perspective. I don't know if you, yes.
Peter, if I could, yeah, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. Irrespective of the consequences at somebody looking over your shoulder, it's just not a good idea to continue to deplete the balance sheet.
Yes,
and that's what's been happening in recent years on wastewater. And I know Steve DeCenzi is on, and that's a concern that his team has been expressing in the past few years, irrespective of whether we actually got into the red on this metric. The bottom line is the net position on wastewater has been declining in recent years, and that is antithetical to the utility financial policy, which speaks to preserving the value of the utility systems. So,
yep. And I don't disagree with you, and I do think it's a good idea to meet your bond covenants,
yep.
which it appears you're not going to. But I wanted to just point that out. That's out there.
While I got the wastewater up, and just before I take it down, unless somebody has any other questions on there, Mayor Anderson, I did look at the wastewater piece of this too, because I wanted to give the cents on the dollar as to where things are going. And under the current estimate, I didn't get it on the screen yet, but 90 cents on every dollar goes to pay wastewater operating expense, and only 9 cents on the dollar in the current estimate goes to pay debt service. But we only had a penny left over for any pay-go capital, unless we, yeah.
On the right of your slide here, it says monthly. That would be quarterly.
Yeah, correct. I didn't change that on wastewater. Thank you.
And I guess I would throw out there that my discussion with James was from the perspective of wastewater. The cost of sludge removal was $4 million, correct?
So previous contracts had annual costs of sludge disposal on approximately 4.5.
And now it's going to be?
Now it's 9.
So there's $4 million not in the forecast.
That's what started this whole conversation, by the way.
Now, Michael, I had one question for you. You haul all your sludge to a landfill.
Correct.
Are there any alternatives to that? And is there any concern with PFAS in that sludge that won't be landfillable in the near future?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to make this is a very complicated conversation. I'm going to try to just hit the high points and talk through it. So Kalamazoo is regulated by state and federal agencies on what we can do with our sludge. Part of that process is that we identify through a residuals management plan, RMP. When we file that with Eagle, what do we plan to do with our sludge? And so our RMP that's filed with Eagle shows that we landfill our sludge. That was a decision that was made a number of years ago that has implications back to our users or sewer use ordinance. And so, we can accept or allow things to come in the plan in a different manner than say we would if we were regulated under the EPA 503 standards for land application. Another component into all this is that we have a pharmaceutical exemption, the only municipal treatment plant in the United States of America that has a pharmaceutical exemption for pharmaceutical manufacturers that stay in our county, that manufacture in our county. So there's a lot of things that are all kind of working their way down the funnel, if you will, to that decision point that is, we're going to landfill our sludge. And so there are other options. There are wastewater treatment plants in Michigan that land apply their sludge. They actually take their biosolids, they take them out to farm fields, and they do what's called beneficial reuse, where they take those nutrients and incorporate those back into the soil. Given our pharmaceutical exemption and given some of our sewer use ordinance local limits that we, kind of purposely set, we in our risk management plan kind of has us landfilling sludge. So we could do something else, but there's consequences to that as well. And for the longest time, we were really happy with this. Our sludge went locally to either Autumn Hills or Westside Landfill. Autumn Hills is just north of us, Westside Landfill is to the south of us. Those landfills got to the point where they could no longer accept their sludge due to both sludge, soil mechanic, structural challenges, which Tom would know a little bit about. Sludge itself acts more like a clay, and wet clay in landfills is not a good thing. Structurally, it's hard for a landfill to build its cells and to build up with that material in it. In fact, our own EPA allied landfill site that we're doing remediation at right now, where we're building this consolidation area, 26 acres, right kind of in the heart of the city. They're actually having to incorporate Portland lime cement to help stabilize that material as they incorporate it. So we have local examples of understanding how material soil mechanics operate within landfills. And so our sludge and our relatively beneficial position here locally with landfills just in north and south got to the point where that was no longer available. So this new contract is really based on our sludge going to Detroit, where it will occupy landfill space there. The distance is much greater to go to Detroit. Even more challenging within that is that depending on the daily low limitations of that Detroit landfill, our sludge may then have to go to Indiana. So what was some very local stuff is now going on. Understanding that this is a concern for us, we initiated the capital improvement project back in 2018 to install centrifuges in the treatment plant, to get away from belt filter presses to install centrifuges. Our average cake solids on our belt filter press was about 18%. And now we've got our centrifuges operating. Our centrifuges just became operational in late June. And we're seeing cake solids of about 24%. So we've got, that's about a 6% increase. We're targeting about a 5% increase in sludge dryness. And so that's less weight, that's less water weight that we're hauling out to landfill. We're seeing less trucks per week that are having to go out to landfill. So there's good news in that project. That was a $13 million project to incorporate centrifuges and odor control improvements at the treatment plant. That project went from 2018 till fully operational centrifuges in June of 2022. So, but back to the drawing board, because that's not enough to offset these now $9 million a year sludge hauling costs. So we are working with an engineer to bring some recommendations back to work on, really start to look at a feasibility study of some energy recovery systems, some kind of next steps of where to go. So we anticipate at the September, actually, let me correct that, it will be at the August 15th meeting. So this Monday, we should have to the city commission a preliminary report by Jones and Henry. It's a request for proposal so that we can have them go do that feasibility analysis to look at ways to reduce our sludge costs. And so that work will get started, and the goal of that work is to get to some answers, some recommendations, not a design, not construction. Those are then later steps, but to really identify what other technologies are available, what other technologies can help us reduce this financial cost that we're seeing. And then further to that point, how do we align our sludge disposal practices at the wastewater plant with the city's new climate and sustainability plan? So that's going to be part of it too. It's recognizing, you know, what is the carbon footprint of what we are doing right now. We know we know it's $9 million a year, but what is the carbon footprint of taking that sludge into gravel train dump trucks and bringing it to Detroit for disposal in the landfill? And what are some other options? So I think our goal is to present some technology options that are in alignment with the community sustainability plan that the city commission has adopted, as well as more affordable options. You know, and that's sustainability too, right? We've got environmental sustainability as well as build the ratepayers. So to that, a little bit of a long-winded response, but I wanted to make sure I was thorough on kind of packaging that all together and take any questions on any.
Any more questions on wastewater? So I guess we need to take an action here on water rates, right? Peter, you've been thinking about this. I don't know if we want to start.
My thought, based on the discussion with the rate consultants, is that we need to accept the fact that we need this medicine or additional revenue, and it's my personal thought would be, rather than going to your board and saying, would you do a 10? We suggest a 10. That we would go to your board and say, we suggest a 25 January, and stick with the concept in the contract that we have an annual rate adjustment when it's necessary, versus the first year of the contract not doing that and having an extra increase. I also wanted to throw out there that there's political aspects to this, that I'm not a politician that has to be in that seat. And so I wanted to get your insight, and Mayor and Libby's insight, that you know, would it be preferable to do a 10 and a 15? Now understanding that wastewater, the city is going to do something, maybe it makes more sense to you to do a 10-10, a 15-15. But overall, I think there needs to be an increase. I don't think we need to say in year 2024 what that increase is, because between now and then, things can change. That's just my big picture, that it's to stick more with the terms of the contract that says there'll be an annual rate, and any increase isn't going to be appreciated. Do you do it twice? But understanding that you're going to do wastewater, I would put to those folks that need to make that happen, and to see that the board approves it, because that's not a given. We don't approve it, or we suggest it, and you need to approve it. So,
Thanks, Peter. Other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree. It's needed.
Yeah.
From a political standpoint, because you're the ones that are going to get the hate. We're sort of insulated here at this board. But I mean, what are you thinking? It'd be nice if Libby was here. Is Libby on the phone? Maybe she could, I don't know if she
could we ask for public comment? Because she would be public at this point, right?
She's not on.
But I don't know why we couldn't ask.
I mean, that's pretty important consideration.
Yeah.
One of the things I've heard kind of along the group and from the professionals here is that the system needs this 25% in effect in place January 1st. Whether we come back with 2 actions or 1 action, but for 2023, the system needs 25%. Is that an accurate summation of it? Okay, so then, and with the water system, it's not as critical that we have a rate adjustment before the end of the year. It's better, but not as, there's not as much red on the screen as what Mr. Foster showed us with the wastewater. And fortunately, we don't have to decide the wastewater topics here right now. But that will have to be decided with a separate discussion, obviously.
Yeah, I'd like to echo kind of what I'm hearing here, Tom, in particular, probably because we're both engineers. The political question is important, and I really need to defer to others, I think, on that. But I've worked with a lot of boards and understand those difficulties, and I'm more inclined to have incremental at a lower number than a big increase all at one time. It just seems to be an easier thing to surmount politically from my experience in working boards. But that's, again, I'm not going to take a position on the timing of it, but clearly there is a needed increase. And see, there's now or later, so.
Well, now and later, or
Well,
later.
yes, now and later, yes, yes.
So in terms of our functioning, do we need to take a specific action on a recommendation, which is just be supportive of a rate increase? I mean, because we don't necessarily need to take an action on saying time and date on it, right? What is our role?
Yeah, if I could just clarify, Your Honor, I think what staff are looking for from the EDC is just some direction on whether or not a mid-year would be preferred, you know, as DC Chairman would say, kind of going up the bat twice, if you will, a mid-year, something that occurred before January and then something then January, or if the EDC rather large increases be brought forward in January. And then that will give us the direction that we need so that we can then go kind of put all this stuff into motion. And then come back, you know, if that was a January recommendation, you know, we would come back with some, you know, formal EDC approval as we go into that, and then all that work to go to the city commission. That said, if it's a January, that means 2 meetings in December to read the ordinance, you know, first reading, a second reading, both meetings in December, and then November would likely be some sort of great presentation, maybe the whole thing. So January doesn't mean we wake up on January 1st and say, hey, let's talk about rate increase. No, that stuff is put, you know, that those wheels are set in motion well ahead. And so I think we're just looking for some broad direction on, you know, is it all at once in January, or is there some support to do some step increments to get there?
So I think the water rate consultant has done their part of saying, here's what we suggest. I think the contract, and I don't know if you're looking for it as well, Tom.
Yeah.
Says specifically what we have to do with that. We might say we don't agree with that. We might say we suggest an increase at a point in time, but I was kind of trying to scramble for it as well. But I think we have to take very specific action to say yes, and so when you find that, I think we ought to probably pull it up and see what the implications are. Now, if we were to say do it effective January 1, that could occur, correct? You do a reading in December.
Yeah,
or whatever.
I would ask for maybe something more broad, not as specific as January 1. I'd say to give the city some direction to seek a rate increase effective in January. Would be probably more doable.
James, if I could jump in, I know there's been a lot of great discussion thus far, but the timing of increases, I think, is an important discussion point because the past practice has been to, really implement these more in a February, more like March timeframe for increases. And if we're able to affect these more in January and get the full year's benefit of the rate increase, if you look at the forecast assumptions that, Bart's presented, instead of doing 10, 15, and then 10s, if we were to not only take the 23 increase, but future increases and adopt them more at the beginning of the calendar year, as opposed to more at the end of the first quarter of the calendar year, you could do a more level plan of 10%. So you could do 10 and 10 instead of 10, 15. If you're committing to that sort of an adoption timeframe longer term, it gives you some more benefit of compounding. And similarly, if that's the practice going forward with a singular adjustment for next year, but you continue to adopt them sooner, that increase next year could be 20% instead of 25 and still achieve the same financial performance if we continue with January 1 increases thereafter. So I just want to raise this because I think it's a pretty important point of discussion that's worth considering, because if it's something that we do not just one time, but continue to be able to adopt increases for more of the fiscal year than what we have been doing, there's some benefit to that in terms of the tough decision you have in front of you today.
For the record, I agree with Andrew, and that notion also, based on my experience, is kind of what was contemplated when the contract was negotiated, and the UPC discussions were out there. I mean, at one time, the contract draft actually said will be effective at January 1st every year, and then we recognized that it wasn't as simple as just checking a box. So I think both utilities would be benefited by moving the approval process to a January implementation.
I have a question for clarification, at least maybe to help us move forward. Is their intent based on what Great Consultant is proposing to address wastewater midterm anyway? Are we looking to do both utility, not that UPC has control over wastewater rate setting at this point, but do we have an intention to bring them both in line together? I think, based on what Andy just said, I think that lines us up for either we have an opportunity potentially to do 10% midterm, and then it's then 10% instead of 15 effective the beginning of the year, which then for those sitting in politically impacted positions, a little more palatable.
If I could jump in here, that's a good question, Jeff. This is Jeff Chamberlain. That we at the city are looking at how do we phase this in, and not having to keep coming back to the commission 2 or 3 times regarding rates. So we are exploring, maybe with wastewater, it sounds like there needs to be some kind of adjustment before the end of the calendar year to have that go into effect. And we're running out already the calendar year here by the time we look at the process. And then what is the rate adjustment needed for water for 23? So the short answer, it seems like the staff are landing regarding wastewater is in the ideal world, there'll still be some adjustment to wastewater in 22. Whether or not we can effectuate that or not, but that's the ideal. Water is not as critical to have an adjustment in 22. But again, looking at how we do the timing and the scheduling of all of them is critical.
Maybe there is potential within the bounds of the contract as the UPC to make a proposal for a transitional 20% at the onset of 2023, but beginning with a 10% increase with the wastewater September 1. And now we've made a decision that adjusts rates in complete aspect for 2023 in one action,
provides us potentially some flexibility for those politically impacted positions, and I'm talking elected council members as well, to have to sell this to their constituents. So it's a bad word to use, but to get that understanding of here's where we are and what we need. I think that might allow us to shave a little edges off the square peg and see if it can drop into that round hole that the contract defines. I also sat quietly for quite a while listening to this and still feel compelled to have to ask the question. Staff are under contract for the city of Kalamazoo, and you set salaries based on contractual negotiations. However, we're discussing 15% electrical cost increases just to operate a water plant and wastewater treatment plants. We have to be cognizant of the impact on fuel, electric, groceries, things of that nature for staff too. Are these rates taking that into consideration as well? And I didn't want to spotlight it on Director Baker saying, hey, we're going to have to add a couple of staff members. Didn't want to turn this into a salary for employees type of discussion. But I believe this group also has a small portion of responsibility when setting the rates, recognizing the impact on those that do the work daily as well.
If I might comment, and this is mainly to say what I think I'm hearing. I've heard the advantage of setting the rates in January and a need, especially sewer, a desirability at least, to make a mid-year adjustment before that. So thinking of a January rate effectiveness for both sewer and water and a midterm, and I'm thinking we're late enough, we're really talking about a final quarter of 2022 to make an adjustment. It's not even scheduled to go to the board earliest in September. So it's basically in October, the third quarter. So I'm thinking, again, I'm just saying what I think I've heard is that a midterm probably, if we have one, would be for the last quarter. And then if we can get some sort of agreement to get ahead of what's anticipated to be effective in January, and that'll give us time to communicate the need to the public so that they'll be prepared at least for the January adjustments. And if we need something before that, and I can support that, because as was said, it's either pay now or pay more later with respect to the midterm adjustment.
So just from that standpoint, we talked about briefly that going to a January 1st rate increase change. I don't know if your administration is capable of doing that this year, but likely if the past practices, it doesn't really go into effect until March. So it's sort of, we're still, if we do something now, it's not that we're just gaining probably 2 or 3 months, we're probably gaining 5 or 6 months. So that's a legitimate, that's just a substantial amount of gain to do the mid-year. For the mechanics on the contract, we really sort of have like 4 options. Either we already agreed on a rate increase from past recommendations, and that hasn't been done. Or we're in dispute, and the dispute resolution. I don't think nobody's disputing the fact that we do this. But the UPC does need to make a recommendation, and the UPC needs to go in front of the city commission. And I think that's really important, again, as we start maturing as a board, that we keep that up so that the city commission understands this process. So we still need to be involved. We still need to make a recommendation today. And then go in front of the city commission. So again, going back to, maybe I misunderstood what Jeff was saying, I mean, or Mayor Anderson, I mean, where you come down, you're the one that sits in the hot seat. I would tend to think that if you're doing a wastewater mid-year, I don't have any problem with doing a mid-year on the water. And then one again on next, March. Make them too smaller, you gain a little time on the water side, mid-year cycle. But it's really, I'm not elected. Yeah, so.
I saw two positives out of Andy's recommendation, and that is 25% because of the extra couple of months going forward in 23, and what we can do now goes down to 20%. So for those politically impacted, 20 is easier to sell. The reasoning, and if you can then split it so that it becomes more of a step, a gradual migration in at 10% and then 10% again, those are the two positive factors going forward on that whole aspect. So our formal action at the table would be, we're recommending a 20% water rate increase and allowing the city the opportunity to step it at 10% in conjunction with a wastewater increase, and then the additional 10% going into 2023 to get them to that 20% total. That's what I'm saying.
And then I would just say after that point, going forward in 24, the discussion would need to be about, implementing the increases more in January. So I think that was very well said. So I think you have that flexibility to do a Q4 increase now at the 10%, and then an increase consistent with past practice, next February, March of another 10%. But then after that, we'd want to get on that January cycle so that we can have future increases reflect the benefit of the compounding, because that's how in the forecast you get to a similar outcome as what BART's current forecast presents, is we have to start shifting to a January cycle after that period.
So for
Who's
clarification,
that is talking right now?
That's Andrew with.
That's Andrew.
just for clarification, is that the recommendation to do a mid-year would be 10 and 10 now and 10 in March? Is that the recommendation?
No, he said 10 now, 10 in January, or 10 now, 15.
So we would only be recommending 10 now, and then the recommendation for January would be forthcoming, or are we making that decision?
I think you could do both. And here it says, unless the city and the utility policy committee agree on the proposed water rate schedule for the rate year, which I would suspect if we proposed it to them and the city approved it, we would agree on it for the rate year. And it says we have to do this. So, and I wish we could pull it up and we could all read that. I'll go get a copy.
Well,
We have.
Oh, you do, okay.
Well, this is Jeff Chamberlain. Andy, if we have a 20% in January, does that get us to the same result also?
It does. Yeah, from using the forecast tool that Bart created, if we just do that increase of 20% in January of next year as a singular increase versus splitting two 10s, it does get us to the same place, assuming that again, going forward in 24 and beyond, we again have increases starting in January each year as opposed to that February, March timeframe.
So may I make a recommendation? And I'm not making this as a motion, I'm just putting this out here for discussion here that, we have a recommendation from, we actually have two consultants on the line. Actually, we have multiple consultants working on this, which is probably the biggest conglomeration of brain power looking at rates that I think we've ever had, which is great. That if the city administration, or let me back up, the UPC per the contract needs to make a recommendation to the city commission. That's established. That's perfect. That, eventually that recommendation could either be a split for this year and next year, or could just be, we could still take the action this year, but make it effective January 1. With that way, I think we're being true to the contract. We're setting an annual rate, but we're also following the consultant's recommendations that we're being consistent with our consultant recommendations. That we could bring a recommendation to the city commission still before the end of the year, but have it already approved and be effective January 1. And we, the administration, would then also work that with the wastewater recommendations, which might have a two-step process, where that might go into effect sometime in 22 and then in 23, but that's separate from this board. So again, I'm throwing that out there for a way to look at the recommendation from the consultant for a 20% increase for 23, but make it effective January 1.
Question on the city administrative side is there's a reason that you have your recommendation to the city commission in February, effective March in the past. Is that for budgetary purposes?
Yeah, I can speak to that. The city has a set timeline. It's actually like city charter when the budget's due, transmitted to the city commission, and then there's actually ordinance reading to set that budget, the big budget, if you will. Over the last 2 years at least, those budgets and that discussion have been very involved. And understanding and recognizing that, we kind of took the utility portions of that out and had separate conversations of them. And so given the timeline that the city commission meets, given there's a very real intellectual capacity that anybody can sit there and get 3 to 4 to 5 hours of budget information presented to them, the decision had been to separate some of these presentations out. And so the timeline yielded the results that were more of a March increase.
Yeah.
But the capacity is totally there to do it ahead of time to make a January. So it was intentional, just given the workflow that we were experiencing.
So shifting this from a March implementation to a January implementation will not have any negative repercussions in terms of making recommendations.
No, we'll be able to do that. If that's the goal and the desire, we can uphold that.
In fact, I like the idea actually of getting it done, not necessarily in December, but getting it done earlier for our budget year, which is what everyone knows is our calendar year. So that would be kind of a nice way to get that part of it done instead of waiting till after everything else.
After
Usually we'll get it done before.
yeah, it's probably a lot easier to calculate what your revenue might be if you know what the rate is.
Yeah.
So it might be good. And of course, you have several readings too, so to get to that point, it takes a bit anyways, right?
Two meetings requires, because it is technically an ordinance, so 2 meetings before the city commission.
So just remind me, I mean, does Bart agree with this? We were talking about 25, and then suddenly drop back to 20, and it's just purely a time issue, a matter of 2 or 3 months makes all that difference.
Another quarter, of revenue at 10% higher, trying to cover the 5, I guess.
Well, if I could, the forecast that we put together on an alternative forecast had the 25 in there, assuming that it was effective on January 1. So this is a lower recommendation than what I had in that alternative forecast, which again was a discussion starter. I'm inclined to suggest to you that 20 is good if it's January 1, because as Andrew pointed out, if you can get back on that January cadence, then the out years have an opportunity to improve the metrics. And as we discussed earlier, the metrics on water really start to turn south, not in 2023, but in 2024 and beyond. So I think if Stantec were to proposed 20% on January 1, that would be something that I would support as well.
Well said, Bart.
I believe it was my understanding from Andrew that a 10% on water matching up with wastewater sometime around the first part of September put us in the position then only to make the step to 20, an additional 10% to get to 20% on January 1. I think that's the piece, the 2 extra months into 23, plus the proactive nature of 10% now meets Mr. Foster's recommendation for 25, but makes it look a little more palatable at a 10% jump and a 10% jump for a final outcome of 20 at this point. Yeah. That was how I was interpreting what Andrew Santek was saying, not just a straight 20% January 1.
Yeah, I think either would work is the point. So if we were to do the 10% in Q4, but then do the other 10% in January, or in March of next year, it would have a similar impact as doing 20% in January. But the key to both of these being viable options, to Bart's point, is that in the future, sticking towards a more January implementation on rates will be important to achieve the compounding benefit to improve the metrics, just given what we're seeing in the forecast for anticipated capital spending and current inflation forecasts. So that's, I think, the subtle distinction between, what Bart had was in the forecast, he had 25% on January 1, but then the future years were all in March. And so what I've really talked about here is kind of an opportunity to maybe, reframe the rate discussion to happen sooner from a process standpoint. And that gives us a little bit more flexibility to do a little bit less now because we have higher future compounding on those forecasted increases.
So this is Jeff Chamberlain again. So just to clarify, for Bart and Stantec, is it your professional recommendations that a 20% January 1st would be the right thing to do for the water system at this time? Make that recommendation.
Let me go first. I'm sensitive to the process here. I'm advising the city. I'm not advising the UPC. So with what I have in front of me and information in the forecast, yes, the recommendation would be 20% on January 1, with the city's discretion to, depending on whether it's more practical to implement water and wastewater adjustments on the same calendar basis, that if there is a fourth quarter wastewater adjustment, it might want to consider taking part of the 20% on the fourth quarter and then the remainder of it in January. But just from a forecasting and recommendation purpose, an adjustment in rates that increases revenues by 20% for the full year of 2023 would be the recommendation.
I agree with that. Well said again, Bart.
Richard Baker, did you have something to add on that? Or?
I was just going to clarify that it perhaps may be helpful for folks, and maybe beyond it, so we don't need to back up, but to put the tool on the screen, we could show you, kind of how, whether it's 9 months or 12 months, and then so that's keying in when that takes effect, and then that kind of that summation over time would help in value. Because I think what's important as we go through, but this is also very important for 24, and so that when we get out to 24, that will also be acting on the January action. And I believe that's what Andy from Stantec is advising, is that that process of March really needs to go away if we're going to see ballpark of the 20%. This needs to be January 23 to January 24 and January moving forward to get us into some better financial position.
Yeah. Jeff, do you see a problem with that at all, as far as other work has to happen on management services, CMO offices?
No, I think I think we're in a position that we can make the changes to water on this schedule, as the consultants have suggested here, or they're talking about. Wastewater, I mean, we'll make the changes work however we have to make them work. Yeah, but yeah, there is things as far as not all bills go out at the same time, so there's another layer of nuance in that, you know, not everybody gets the same bill every month. So there's staggered too. So that's something that our management services staff will factor in.
So do we have is someone comfortable making a motion with language it feels like we've kind of come to?
I'll make a motion, subject to change by when you tell me that we would propose to the city commission a 20% rate increase for water effective January 1 or as close there, you know, as possible.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're looking for.
Moving forward.
And moving forward, a target date of January 1 thereafter. That's just the target date.
Search support.
Support.
All right. Any further discussion on that motion?
The only further discussion is that the UPC will need to be in front of the city commission.
Yes.
So just, and I'm happy to do that. I did it last year.
I did as well.
Yep.
But you're close, so.
Yeah.
Did we attend both meetings?
I went once, you went once, because I was on vacation.
Yeah.
So I
So
could
it
go to
says
both.
before you approve, the commission approves it, that the UPC needs to attend, and we had decided to attend both.
When
But we
would
can
that be?
decide that going forward.
That'd be December 5th
Okay.
and December 19th. Because this is the ordinance, so we need those, you know, 2 meetings.
Okay. So that gives us plenty of time to discuss who actually is going to.
And we could even take it early, or it may be earlier if we tie it together with a wastewater
Sure,
rate
sure,
increase. But again, the motion would be effective January 1 for water.
Actually, I should not have to do with January. December.
Question on Peter, your motion. And perhaps, we're basically talking about one annual adjustment effective in April or January 1. And I heard your concern about just making one adjustment a year based on the contract, so I'll defer to that. And I will support this motion, but I'm wondering if it's appropriate or even possible to offer to the city that we could also support a 10 and 10. Or maybe you think it would be available to them regardless, I don't know. I'm just throwing that out, maybe it's needless complex. I'd be interested in your commentary on that suggestion, giving them an alternate to do it incrementally.
Yeah. I don't know that that's necessary, Jeff. I guess I would defer to you.
And that's why I asked the question of the consultants, that I think legitimately speaking from a financial standpoint, the 20% effective January will get us to where we need to be. A 10% and 10% will still get us there, but it's not necessary. And, you know, to be frank, you know, we, after hours and hours and hours of discussion regarding a contract, and we just never anticipated a mid-year because it had never happened in decades and decades of utility work. So I think, again, to just try to be consistent with the process that we started up last year, this will get us to the right spot using the right process.
Any other discussion? There's a motion on the floor. Roll call.
I think it should be roll
We'll
call.
do a roll call. So, Tom Weed?
Yes.
Jim Esquila?
Yes.
John Crum?
Yes.
Peter Hefner?
Yes.
And you are voting for Libby?
Mark Elliott as an alternate for the UPC, I vote yay.
Okay. And yes. That's right, you are now
You guys get to
on
vote.
this board
So,
officially.
yeah,
Jeff Chamberlain.
again, Jeff Chamberlain as alternate for the city of Kalamazoo, voting yes.
Thank you very much. Motion passes. Do we want to, we're pushing almost 2 hours here. We got water connection extensions and fees. Do we have?
Work in progress. I'm glad that you are engaging Stantec to have a look at that as well, so we can hold those conversations in the future.
Yep. All right, thanks, Tom. Capital improvement, is there anything we need to talk about?
Nothing really needed, it's just a reminder that the city will wrap up its budget process and have, a new 5-year CIP ready to review in October. We'll conclude that work in September, but it won't be available in December timing, so it'll be available in October. And so we'll bring that forward for some information. This year, we're kind of getting things out of order, certainly, but we certainly have a chance to review and support that CIP, but there's not going to be we're not going to go backwards with rates and really big rates. So just it's going to be more from a project standpoint, project focus.
All right, thanks, Mr. Baker. City UPC appointment?
We don't have any other updates on that right now.
Okay. Got revenue and expense reports.
We'll look at that at the quarter, after the quarters close out.
Okay, great. And we got a couple other things. We got any proposed update to the utility financial policy?
I think we can look at that going forward. I mean, we've discussed it pretty thoroughly today. Some of it was right up on the board.
Yeah.
So probably bring the formal policy to the group in the future.
Okay, great. Adding an additional rate consultant to the pre-qualified.
Yeah, so the township side of UPC has used our co-champ as second opinion in the past.
That's
And that's
utility financial.
Utility financial solution.
Yes,
And been happy with his, and we're not looking to throw, a third rate consultant in here, but just to get him pre-qualified, so he's on the bench, so that if we have a question, we can do that through the contract. So just letting you know that I'll get with James and get the criteria for that in front of Mark, so that he can get you the information.
So there's some challenges. We issued a RFQ for rate consultants, and that firm you named did not submit. So.
Well, those are two, I mean, that was to do the actual consulting for the city under the contract.
Right.
This would be
Did Bart
pre-qualified.
No.
This would be to be pre-qualified to provide services to the UBC.
So this would be like a UBC consultant.
Yeah.
Okay.
The $75,000 UBC.
Yeah, okay, I was trying to understand.
yeah. Just to use this individual, should there be a question of what is your outside thought?
Okay,
Just.
So UPC would have to decide to use the individual.
right, so this would be the city's not gonna, city can
Yes.
carry the cost, but it's part of your budget.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, yeah, we'll have to work on, to follow city policy, we will have to issue the RFP for that.
I think, James, we will work this through.
Okay.
There's a provision that we can use pre-qualified consultants as part of the consulting team for the UPC.
Understand, that firm is not gonna qualify.
Correct. I think that's the process. Well, I think we can work with.
Become qualified, we have to go through the RFQ process in accordance with the city's policy. I can't, from this seat, change the policy.
Right.
We can apply.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Why don't we work with Mr. Wheat to figure out what the process would be.
Yeah, we can get there. I'm happy we can get there.
Yeah.
We need to follow the process.
And we're not looking to start that process. We just want to understand it so we can start that. So who do I work with? Jeff or?
Contact me and James. We'll work together on it.
Thank you.
Hey, here's something that was on the agenda, but we did get an invoice, right? Did we get an invoice that got sent to us via email? And does that need to be, do we need to take action on it? I don't see that.
Yes.
Well, Wendy, did you get mine? No?
We didn't get it.
No, you didn't get mine either. I can't get it to you by that time, so it'll be a month behind.
So there's one,
I thought they would go out with the minutes, and when I saw the minutes, I didn't give one.
yeah, this came in a little after the minute.
So our timing
That's
is
fine.
we go through the end of the month. And by the time it gets to our
Ours,
process.
too, I don't know why they.
So it's always gonna get to Wendy like last week, like the week before the UPC. So it's getting to you at the same time that the meeting notes are going out. I don't have any problem if we lag a month, if that's a problem.
You'll get it eventually.
Nobody's seen it, so I haven't anyway. I was
Want
hoping
to act
we
on
could
this
get
one
it
at
with
this
the
meeting?
minutes.
Or wait to do them all at once?
We just do it next month would be my proposal. We'll be a month behind. I don't think anybody can get them there before
You
the
might
minutes.
have two from Tom, you might even have two from me, you know, by that.
That's fine. Okay, let's just don't forget this one because see that.
All right. So first of all, what, I don't know, is there anyone who wants to make any extra comments, I guess, at this point? Any guests on all this?
It was a good meeting. Very pleased.
Appreciate that.
Just after my comments last meeting, I appreciate all your concern going through this, and I really appreciate following what I feel is the intent of the contract. I realize it's been done a lot of ways, so only months into the contract. But I think it's important. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other member comments? Have we go to the order? So I was just gonna say, I think for me, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, water billing and all that kind of thing. It is still an education, just going through what we're doing here. So for an actual functioning UPC, I can't remember what our terms are, but I hope people stay around for a little while because you really begin to build up a body of knowledge, some history that does make a difference when it comes to these discussions that I think creates understanding and will create a little more efficiency on decision making as we go forward on this. So anyway, please don't plan to leave.
You gotta be in the regional commission. I think
And thank you for coming to every meeting, even though you're not, that makes you totally up to speed on that. So that all said, our next meeting is September 8th here at 8:30 a.m. We're adjourned.
Thank you.